Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. You guys have been asking me to cover this prolific serial killer, and today we're discussing Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer. This is going to be a 3-part video series. You know I don't do these multi-part videos very often, but if you like these deep dives, please give the video a like and comment down below if you want more of these. But with that being said, let's get into it. It was in Washington state in the summer of 1982 when 5 women's bodies would be found in the Green River. This would start the hunt for one of America's most prolific serial killers. On July 15, 1982, 2 boys were biking along the Green River in Kent, King County, Washington. While crossing a bridge, they noticed something in the water below them. When the boys went to take a closer look, they found a naked woman's body stuck to one of the bridge's pilings. The body was found wearing socks and shoes, with the other clothes tied around the neck like a ligature. An autopsy would show the cause of death to be strangulation, and she'd also suffered a broken arm. The police eventually identified the body as 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. In July 1982, Wendy was living with a foster family in Tacoma, Washington. On July 8th, she left her home and was not seen again. The police believe that Wendy was killed shortly after July 8th.
Only 2 days after Wendy's body is removed from the water, the Green River Killer strikes again. Within a month, 5 more bodies dumped in the Green River. To elude police, the killer gradually expands his dump sites to a 50-mile radius of the Strip. Like at Star Lake Road, a remote wooded grove where 6 skeletons are found. For a year and a half, a young woman disappears or a body is discovered at the rate of almost 1 per week. Then, for inexplicable reasons, the killing in Seattle ends. The Green River Killer goes on the move. 22 women dead, 4 officially attributed to the killer. New killing fields. More than 38 bodies have been recovered. The most recent, just last week. The victims, street people. Most killed like those in Seattle. Some believe it might be the work of the Green River Killer.
Wendy was known to frequent the Pacific Highway South, or PHS, as a sex worker. The PHS was known as the Strip in Seattle, and it was an area known for its strip clubs, adult stores, bars, as well as a place to go to find sex workers and drugs. Almost a month later, on August 12th, another body was found in the Green River. This body was found downstream. The body had been caught on some built-up logs. The body was completely naked, with no clothing or other evidence found. Law enforcement would eventually identify her as 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner, a known sex worker who also worked the Strip, and she'd been known to law enforcement, having been arrested twice in the 30 days prior to her disappearance. She was last seen on July 25th, leaving a hotel in Kings County. 3 more bodies would be found in the same area of the Green River. On August 15th, only a few days after Deborah was found, a man was rafting down the river when he saw 2 bodies at the bottom. They were naked and covered in large rocks. They were located 600 yards from where Deborah's body had been discovered. Police arrived and removed the 2 women from the water. And while searching the surrounding area for evidence, they found another body on the bank of the river. The 2 bodies found in the water were identified as 31-year-old Marcia Chapman and 17-year-old Cynthia Hines. 16-year-old Opal Mills was identified as the body found on the bank of the river. All of their causes of death was strangulation. Semen samples were found on Marcia and Opal's bodies, but DNA was not what it is today in 1982, but the samples were preserved.
In the sterile language of cops, this is a dump site.
About 3 or 4 scarred rosters fall off the cliff.
You are about to go behind police lines. You are Detective Dave Reichert. You've been with the investigation since the very first victim.
I've located the mandible. There are also some teeth missing from that.
40 times before, you've followed the same path as the killer.
Immediately visible at this time.
This is the closest you've ever come to meeting him.
The remains are kind of scattered.
Somewhere there may be a clue, slender as a sliver of the killer's fingernail, buried in over an acre of brush.
That looks like a Band-Aid or a piece of gauze.
That's why you clear the site with scissors. Shovel with tweezers.
Hey, Dave. David, where are you? Come here. We got what?
All right, yeah.
A robin's nest, dismantled strand by strand, in case a bird has woven in a thread of the killer's coat.
108.
The work resembles, but is even more precise than an archaeological dig.
6 inches.
Young female. I don't know, race is going to be a problem until we get back in the
On the human body, there are few parts that don't decompose in the first year. The hair mass, nails, and the bones. But rarely do they disclose identity. The surest ID tags are the teeth, which hold the secrets of age, and, through dental records, the exact identity of the victim.
I think that the other features of the skeleton certainly put it in that mid-second decade of life.
Yet even that may not be enough. In Seattle, there are 3 boxes which enclose remains that cannot be buried. They are the unidentified, but they are not forgotten.
Marcia Chapman was working as a sex worker to take care of her 3 children. On August 1st, 1982, she left her apartment that she shared with her children and was never seen again. On August 11th, 10 days later, Cynthia Hines was working on the PHS when her pimp recalled that she was getting into a Jeep with a John, and she was not seen after that. 1 day later, Opal Mills called her parents around 1 p.m. from a phone in Angle Lake State Park near the PHS. That was the last anyone had heard from her. Her family had been adamant that Opal hadn't been involved in any illicit business on the PHS, but friends would tell police that they knew Opal would partake in sex work occasionally. Months following the discovery of the bodies, a task force would be made in hopes of finding what they now believed to be a serial killer. But that would not be the end. Over the next few years, a task force would be called in to the site of more and more victims. By 1984, they believed they had more than 19 connected victims. All of the women were found in secluded areas around the Seattle-Tacoma area, and all had been strangled. The community was outraged by the increasing amount of dead women, as well as missing persons cases. Sex workers stopped working the strip, and those that remained would create safety measures, working in groups, taking down license plates, and carrying protective equipment. There were even protests and demonstrations from people who believed that law enforcement were not doing everything they could because a majority of the murdered women were sex workers.
Over 21 women have disappeared from this street and turned up later, murdered and dumped on the outskirts of the city. The killer or killers is still at large.
Live from Times Square, New York City, Detective Joe Serlak.
Our suspect has killed several women here in the New York area and moved on. We tracked them across the country by carrying dead bodies. He loves them, then leaves them dead.
From Nashville, Tennessee.
I'm Detective Mike Smith of the Metropolitan Police Department. In Nashville, we're part of a multi-state investigation in the red-headed murder cases. At least 8 women have been dumped off of main roads and interstate highways in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky.
From Utah, Detective Jim Bell.
Here in Salt Lake City in the northern Utah area, we've got 14 murdered or missing women.
From Washington State, Sheriff James Montgomery.
There may be 300 serial killers across the country. Here in Seattle-King County, we've got the biggest case in America. He's killed at least 48 teenage girls that we know of.
And most were taken from the SeaTac Strip, Pacific Highway South, not too far from the airport. It's a highly transient area, south of Seattle, near the Green River. That's where they found the first body. The killer has eluded police for 6 years, but he's still out there, somewhere in America, stalking a highway in search of his next victim. Now it's time for you to stop him and help bring him to justice. On Manhunt, live.
A police dog, tracking the remains of a victim found across the road, picks up a new scent and another body. But this one is different from all the others. It's the first one that's been buried. But why? To find out, police sift every grain of soil. But it's the remains themselves that give the real answer. The killer made a mistake. He murdered someone he didn't count on. A mother 8 months pregnant.
With me now is Dave Reichert, lead detective of the Green River Task Force. Dave, the clip was just over about the girl 8 months pregnant. What other mistakes or information do you have about the killer?
Well, one of the most important facts that we know is that our killer was driving a pickup truck in 1983. And we have 5 cases where we have witnesses who have identified one of our victims being in or near a pickup truck. In 3 of those cases, the pickup truck was described as a Ford pickup truck, late 60s, early 70s model. The other 2 were a GMC product. Now, some of these witnesses also described the bumper of the truck as being white in color. That's the rear bumper. The canopy was a light color and was about cab high, or just a little bit higher, maybe 2 or 3 inches higher. The passenger side of the truck had primer spots on it, like the killer had done some body work to it.
So that's important then, that the killer may have repainted his truck a number of times.
Yes, that's true.
The FBI would lend a hand, giving this profile to their suspect and aspects that they believed would match their killer. Caucasian male in his late 20s or early 30s, familiar or has an emotional tie to the Green River, has a higher than average intelligence, drives conservative older vehicles, low self-esteem, divorced. They also noted that he was an impulse killer. They speculated that he didn't leave the house going to kill. The timeline was random, sporadic, and increasing in frequency. They said that their suspect would be someone who frequented the PHS but flies under the radar. A majority of his encounters with sex workers would be non-violent, which would build up trust. In their profile, they also said that growing up, he may have been raised in a broken home by his mother as a prominent parental figure.
The guy is a white male, about 40, single, probably ex-military person, right around 40, late 30s, early 40s. I think he's probably in the construction trades. He can get up and move to another area and get a job easily.
They said that he wouldn't have issues approaching or talking to women, but that the killer felt lied to or fooled by women one too many times. They also felt that he targeted sex workers because he wasn't charming enough to pick up women at bars. They also suggested that he didn't approve of women doing sex work despite being a customer. He didn't view sex workers as people. The profile concluded that, quote, possibly the subject is killing because the victims are not listening to his preaching regarding their activities, or making fun of him or laughing at him. He is an angry individual who demonstrates power over his victims and enjoys the publicity he is receiving. They released this to the public, and then they opened tip lines asking for information if anyone knew of anyone who may be the killer, may fit the profile, or have any sort of relation to the victim. On the tip line, they got a call from a man named Melvin Foster, who gave a tip that a man named Dan Smith might be involved. They brought in Dan Smith and quickly eliminated him as a suspect. The detectives on the task force would remember that the FBI told them that the suspect might call and insert himself into the investigation and may even point fingers at someone else. This made them look into Melvin Foster. Melvin Foster was a taxi driver who worked the Strip. They brought him in for questioning, he eventually admitting to having some of the victims in his taxi at one point or another. He was asked to do a polygraph, which he agreed, but when asked questions about the victims and if he knew anything about the Green River killings, he failed the polygraph. The Green River Task Force would put Foster under 24-hour surveillance for months, but they never got anything from the surveillance, which was eventually stopped.
Been called the Green River Killer ever since the first bodies, 5 of them, were pulled from this river. Since then, 7 more bodies have been discovered nearby, all those of young prostitutes, according to police. And the number of missing increases steadily. 2 were added to the list this week. All the victims worked this strip near the Seattle airport, crammed with hotels, motels, and strip joints. Angry residents are demanding police do more to stop the killings. One young prostitute who operates along the strip said she's terrified every time she's picked up.
I don't know, I guess I'm just lucky that I never came across that certain freak.
Police say the victims are similar, runaways, very young, disturbed. Most were strangled, their bodies left nude. A police task force has little hard evidence, but it thinks a single psychopathic killer is responsible.
However, it would be illogical and improper from an investigative perspective to become that tunnel visioned and exclude the possibility of any copycat crimes or the possibility of a multiple suspect.
Police suspect other prostitutes might be able to provide leads, but because of their profession, they've been uncooperative.
In December 1984, a woman came forward after seeing a news report with the detectives from the task force asking for help. Rebecca Jardigwe would explain that she'd been assaulted by a man that she believed might have been the Green River Killer. In November of 1982, she was hitchhiking on the PHS when a man pulled up in his truck and offered her a ride. She asked if he was looking for a date and offered him oral sex for $20. He accepted, and she told him where to stop. She would ask if he was the Green River Killer jokingly, and to prove he wasn't, he would show her IDs from his wallet, which included a work ID for Kenwood Trucking Company. He asked if she would go into the woods to perform the sex act. She accepted, and they walked into the woods together. When the man stopped, he pulled down his shorts and she began. When he didn't seem to get erect, he pushed her down, accusing her of biting him. He got Rebecca in a chokehold. She managed to escape and flee to a nearby trailer. The man pulled up his shorts and attempted to chase her. Realizing he couldn't catch up, fled back to his truck and drove off. She was reluctant to come forward because she was a sex worker at the time of the attack. The task force would look at files of men known to use sex workers. They found one who worked at Kenworth Trucking Company. They put his picture in a 6-photo lineup. Right away, Rebecca picked out the man, and they had the name Gary Ridgway. In early 1985, a task force member went and talked to Ridgway, asking about the incident with Rebecca, and he admitted it, saying that he only choked her because she had bit him. No charges were ever filed at that time against Ridgway. They never stopped looking into him after this, though, but this was not the first time he'd been on law enforcement radar. Back in 1983, Ridgway was interviewed by law enforcement about a missing teen. On April 30th, 1983, 18-year-old Marie Malvar was working the PHS strip. Shortly after having a meal with her boyfriend, he saw her get into a dark-colored truck near the bus stop at South 216th and the PHS, with only one man in the vehicle. After she got in the truck, her boyfriend got in his car and followed them. The truck first went north, then turned around in a motel parking lot and headed south. After a few turns, the boyfriend lost the vehicle. Marie was never heard from again. On May 3rd, the boyfriend reported her missing to the Des Moines Police Department. He had lied the first time he spoke to them, saying that he'd last seen her at their home and that she'd left to use a payphone at the PHS. On May 4th, he would admit to knowing that Marie was a sex worker and had likely picked up a John. He described the man as a Hispanic male in his 40s driving a dark pickup truck. Also on May 4th, the boyfriend searched the neighborhood for the truck hoping to find it. He went back to the Des Moines Police Department and reported that he believed he'd found the truck parked outside 21859 32nd Place South. Police detectives went to the residence and saw a maroon truck outside. They talked to the residents. They found Gary Ridgway and they interviewed him. He admitted to being arrested in the past for picking up sex workers, but that he knew nothing of Marie. He also told detectives that he'd been unemployed for the past year and he'd actually been on strike with his work at Kenworth. He was not considered a suspect after this interview. Marie's driver's license would be found at the SeaTac airport several weeks later. Many tips would come in about sightings of Marie, that she was in Hawaii or Hollywood. One tipster would even say they were with her brother when he got a call from Marie. In February 1985, her family expressed their belief that she was still alive, hearing that she'd been seen in Hollywood, Tacoma, and Long Beach. None of these tips would be confirmed, and Marie's body would not be found until 2003. By 1985, the killings all but seemed to have stopped, which was very odd as most serial killers usually continue killing until they're caught or dead, leaving detectives to believe that the Green River Killer might have moved or had started dumping bodies elsewhere. The task force kept looking into every possibility.
Police in Washington state believe they found the remains of another victim of the so-called Green River Killer. The victim, identified Monday as 17-year-old Cindy Ann Smith, was last seen in March of 1984. Police believe that Smith is the killer's 37th known victim, all of them women ranging from 16 to 36 years of age. The murders began in summer of 1982, and since then an army of detectives and a multi-million-dollar computer system have been unable to crack the case.
Once on the radar of the task force, they started interviewing people around Gary Ridgway. They also talked to the witnesses who had last seen some of the victims. Some were even able to pick him out of the photo lineup tentatively. Many reports had the suspect using different colored pickup trucks, and Gary had a maroon truck. But they learned that he had access to his brother's blue vehicle, as well as his father's truck at the time.
In this country, in Washington state, still another victim has been identified in the nation's longest list of unsolved murders, the Green River killings. 37 women have died, 9 missing, all thought to be victims of the same killer. John Sandifer of KING-TV in Seattle has the latest.
It was a familiar routine for the Green River Task Force, sifting through any remaining evidence at a site where someone, in this case 3 young boys, had stumbled across human remains. After the passage of 3 years, they would not find much more than a skeleton. Late Monday, the remains would be identified as those of 17-year-old Cindy Ann Smith, last seen in March 1984 hitchhiking from her mother's home to that of her sister in Seattle. She is victim number 37. Cindy disappeared from a strip of highway south of Seattle where no fewer than 18 other young women, mostly prostitutes, dropped out of sight beginning in the summer of 1982. The first grisly discoveries of their bodies was along the picturesque Green River, hence the name that has come to represent untold horror to many in the Northwest. The Green River murders have included victims ranging in age from 16 through 36. Most of their bodies have been recovered in wilderness dumping grounds in groups of 2, 3, and up to 7. The Green River Task Force has employed up to 50 full-time detectives and a multi-million-dollar computer system to crack the case. They have served at least 2 search warrants, but as of this morning, the killer remains unidentified. And Cindy Smith's disappearance was the last one in this area 3 years ago.
Gary Ridgway would be interviewed several more times over the next few years. At one point in 1984, he would be brought in for a polygraph asking if he knew anything about the Green River killings and if he'd met any of the victims. He passed the polygraph, saying he didn't know anything about them. In 1987, Ridgway was served with a search warrant for his home, including several vehicles, his person, and his workplace. They found Ridgway at his workplace when they served the warrant. The search warrant was given because they'd found metal fragments consistent with ones found at Kenworth Trucking. Green carpet fibers were also found on several bodies, and interviews with people who had been inside his home reported seeing similar carpets in the bedrooms. What they were hoping to find more than anything else were victim trophies. Serial killers are often profiled keeping trophies as a reminder of their kills and an ability to relive their fantasies. After searching everywhere, his home, backyard, work locker, and several vehicles, they could not find anything that directly connected him to any of the victims. They did, however, get one piece of evidence they hoped would help. They got Ridgway to chew on a cotton ball, and they had his saliva. Even though the task force was very suspicious of Ridgway, with no evidence being found that directly connected him to the victims, they were not able to take him into custody or charge him with any crime. From the saliva sample taken from Ridgway, they hoped that at the time, in 1987, they could get a blood type and match it to the blood type found on the bodies of the two victims in 1982. They were able to get a definitive match, but evidence would be put in the freezer in the hopes that they could use it in the future. In the late 1980s, the task force was reduced due to budget cuts, with no concrete suspects and over thousands and thousands of man-hours devoted to the project. It cost more than $15 million from 1983 to 1990 to run the task force. That did not mean that they stopped looking for answers on who killed what was believed at the time to be more than 40 women. In 1992, one detective remained working on the Green River Killer case, Detective Tom Jensen. Detective Jensen was left to review the case files and look into new tips. In 2001, almost 20 years after the first body was found, he got approval to get evidence retested with new DNA evidence and sequencing technology. In September 2001, they found a match to the DNA found on all three of the victims. After all this time, the DNA matched Gary Ridgway. On November 16, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested after trying to pick up a King County Sheriff's officer who was posing undercover as a sex worker. He had asked if she was dating and agreed to meet her down the road and was arrested on the spot. When being interviewed during his booking, he asked the detectives not to call his wife but said, quote, "You can contact the Green River Task Force. They know me really well." On November 30th, 2001, he was arrested while leaving work for first-degree murder.
Explorer scouts today found a fourth skeleton in a wooded area outside of town where 3 other skeletons were discovered this weekend. So far, 16 murders have been blamed on the Green River Killer. Most of the victims have been young prostitutes. This latest find would bring that gruesome total to 20, putting it among the largest mass murders in American history.
In December 2001, Ridgway was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in the cases of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Christensen. His DNA was found in the bodies of all the women except for Cynthia Hines, but due to her being found so close to the other victims, they had no doubt that the same person had killed her. We've covered Marcia, Opal, and Cynthia's cases, but 21-year-old Carol Christensen was found on May 8, 1983, in a wooded area in Maple Valley. She was dressed and her body had been posed. One of the only victims found this way. She was found on her back with 2 fish placed on her torso, a bottle of wine across her stomach, and sausages on her hands. She had also been strangled. Carol was last seen May 3, 1983, leaving her work at the Barn Door Tavern. She was supposed to return but never did. Co-workers said she was known to hitchhike around the area. Later, Ridgway would be asked why he'd posed her this way, and he would say it was all an effort to confuse the task force at the time, that none of the items had a specific meaning, and that he'd redressed her and placed things he had in his house that he didn't care about. Gary Ridgway pleaded not guilty to all charges. On April 15, 2002, prosecutors filed a written notice that they planned to seek the death penalty. Over the next year, detectives and prosecutors would go over all the believed Green River cases, hoping to find forensic evidence to file possible new charges. They would send hundreds of pieces of evidence to be tested. While this was going on, the King County Superior Court put a charging deadline on March 28, 2003 to ensure the trial against Ridgway proceeded in a timely manner. Right before the deadline, a private laboratory found evidence of paint smears on 2 victims, Wendy Caulfield and Deborah Estes. The paint matched highly specialized paint used in Kenworth truck paint, where Ridgway worked. On May 30, 1988, construction workers digging for a playground found the remains of 15-year-old Deborah Estes in a shallow grave in Federal Way, Washington. They found 2 pieces of clothing with the remains of a bra and fragments from a black sweater with metallic threads. A witness confirmed that she was wearing it on September 20th, 1982, when she was last seen near a motel. Deborah was working as a sex worker at the time. Prosecutors would file 3 additional murder charges against Ridgway for the murders of Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Estes, as well as Deborah Bonner, the last of the victims found in the Green River, on March 27, 2003, the day before the deadline. Gary Ridgway would plead not guilty to the additional charges. The trial was set for July 2004.
The Southern California sun, which brings beauty and brightness to San Diego, is in stark contrast to the growing darkness along the city's El Cajon Boulevard. Someone is killing the women whose lives are spent on that street. Prostitutes, drug users. When 20-year-old Melissa Sandoval's body was discovered in May, dumped in a rural area, the string of unsolved murders of women in San Diego County reached 25.
In your 18 years with this department, have you seen anything like this?
Absolutely not, no.
The killings have fallen into a pattern. Many of the victims had ties to El Cajon Boulevard. Most were prostitutes. Most were strangled. The victims were nude or partially nude. The bodies were dumped in clusters in rural areas near highways. It is a pattern chillingly familiar to other police on the West Coast.
This is the Green River near Seattle, which gave its name to the worst string of unsolved serial murders in U.S. history. Female victims, most prostitutes, all believed killed by the same person.
The 5 bodies of women pulled from the Green River starting in 1982 were only the beginning. With growing disbelief, police in Seattle's King County eventually tied the murders of 41 women and the disappearance of 7 others to the same killer, a serial killer they have never caught.
The hardest thing to come to grips with for a lot of us is that this could have occurred here in our community for such a period of time, and as we sit here, that person responsible is yet to be brought to justice.
After reviewing hundreds of pieces of evidence and witness statements, they were unable to tie Ridgway directly to any further victims. But shortly after the additional charges, Ridgway's defense team came to the prosecution with a proposition. If they removed the death penalty, Ridgway was willing to plead guilty to the 7 counts of murder, give details, and plead guilty to an additional 40 to 47 additional counts and serve life in prison without parole. Gary Ridgway also said that he would provide candid accounts of his crimes in King County, as well as direct detectives to undiscovered remains of the victims not yet found. In April 2003, the prosecution had a decision to make. They could go to trial with the 7 counts and put it to the jury, hoping they would get the death penalty, or they could take the deal. Ridgway would spend his life in prison, and more than 40 families and the task force would have answers they'd waited decades for. On June 13, 2003, the prosecution agreed to the plea agreement that would put Gary Ridgway in prison for the rest of his life. Gary would provide information on all the crimes he'd committed in King County before and after the 1982 to 1984 killing spree. He would also show detectives locations of previously undiscovered remains and would give details only the killer would know of the official known victims. By identifying the unsolved murders, detectives were able to determine victims for which Ridgway was not responsible, and those cases could be looked at with an eye on a new suspect. The plea agreement contract included that if Ridgway was not completely candid or if he failed to disclose any of the victims, he could face the death penalty for all of his crimes. Starting in June 2003 and continuing for 5 months, Gary Ridgway was interviewed by the prosecution and task force detectives. Ridgway would claim he killed over 60 women in the King County area. As part of testing his claim to have killed his victims, he led detectives to places he left bodies and gave intricate details not previously known to detectives that had worked that case for decades. He also led them to locations that were never originally attributed to the Green River Killer. He also took them to sites of previously undiscovered remains that were missing persons believed to be Green River Killer victims, including Pammy Avant, April Buttram, and Marie Malvar, the teen he was previously questioned about in 1983. He gave details of remembering being interviewed about Marie. He had leaned against a door while being interviewed so that detectives would not be able to see the scratches she had left on his arm the day before. After they left, he had poured battery acid on the scratches to disguise them. He talked about how often he did things like that. If he got hurt while moving a body, he'd fake a work injury and go on workers' compensation. He said he didn't smoke or chew gum, but would often leave wrappers and butts, even motel flyers at crime scenes to confuse law enforcement, that he would hide scratches. In his interview, he would also admit that if he got scratched, he would cut the victim's fingernails to avoid detection. In 1984, Ridgway wrote a letter to a local newspaper. It was typed, not handwritten, and it was titled, "What You Need to Know About the Green River Man." It gave falsehood of what the person did for a living, saying he was a salesman. It also gave details of the crimes, including the fingernails being cut, which investigators did not know until told to them by Ridgway. The letter was sent to the FBI and was concluded not to be from the killer. Gary confirmed that it was, in fact, from him. One of the last things he did to try and throw off the task force was when he dumped 2 bodies in Portland, Oregon, trying to get the task force to believe that he'd moved on. During his 2003 interview, he first started by giving bits and pieces of information. Initially, he minimized his actions because he didn't want his friends or family knowing what he had done. Early on, he would claim that he didn't plan to kill women when he picked them up. He would wait until something had provoked him into a rage. He would later admit that he would always plan to kill the women once he picked them up, offering them more money than they'd asked for, because he knew he would never pay it, and that he might actually make money if the women had any cash on them when he killed them. He talked about how he would use the picture of his son to put his victims at ease, showing his ID covering his name with his son's picture below it. That was not the only way his son was involved. He would admit to picking up his second victim, 19-year-old Giselle Lavorne, in 1982 with his then 7-year-old son in the vehicle. He would pick her up for a date, and she directed him to a spot. He told his son that he was going for a walk with the woman and to stay in the car, and once out of his sight, they would have sexual intercourse, and that he thought he heard his son. When she looked up from behind, Ridgway put her in a chokehold until she passed out. He then used his socks tied together, wrapped around her neck, and used a stick to tighten until he was satisfied that she would not regain consciousness. He went back to his son and dropped him off, returning later to dispose of the body. He also admitted to returning to the body days later, while his son was sleeping in the car, to have sex with the body post-mortem. He often took women back to his house and would show them his son's bedroom before he killed them. In the interview, he admitted that dozens of women asked if he was the Green River Killer when they got in his car and before he killed them. He would use his small stature and picture of his son to explain he could never be the killer. Some would be reluctant to get into his vehicle because they believed he was a cop. He'd keep beer in his truck and offer it to them, saying that he wasn't a cop. He explained in the interview that these were not random spur-of-the-moment killings, that he would get in his truck and go out specifically with the intention of picking up sex workers to kill them. He said that he only ever picked up street-walking sex workers because they were less likely to be reported missing quickly. This is true, and it was often days or weeks after the women went missing that it was reported.
You went to a lot of work to create these ruses, and it sounds to me like you had a series of ruses that you had kind of in your hip pocket. That you would bring out and you would use to make you appear normal to some of these women. And there had to be a way of you deciding, even though it was just like that, which ruse would work with which woman. I mean, you had to have a way of feeling them out and saying, I think ruse number 1, 2, 3 will work with this woman. Explain that process to me.
Well, one of them was, woman would get in the car.
She's already in the car?
She's in the car. Let's say she's always in the car. We're driving down the road, And she wants to see my ID. So I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. But on the opposite side was pictures. A picture of my son. And they would see my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person.
But you were really using your son as part of your ruse.
This is only at the time I didn't want to picture my ex-wife there, so I had to have a picture of my son.
Sure, you had to make it sound good.
I had a driver's license on one side, my ID, and then when I showed and then the next picture was my son. So that was, and in the vehicle I had always had some, not always, but had some of my son's stuff in there, that he left in there, or some Star Wars or something like that. So it was like a family setting.
In your vehicle.
Yeah. So every time I opened up my wallet, there would be a picture of my son on one side, behind my ID. There's my ID. I hide my name, flip it over, and there's my ID and my son's picture on the back side, and they'd see that, and that would lower any big defenses. And kids' toys, 8-year-old toys on the dash.
The only thing that would be better than that would be to have your son in the car with you. That would be a incredible ruse.
That happened once.
What happened?
It was July 18th, I think it was my brother's birthday. That weekend I picked up a woman on Back Highway, and Matthew was next to me in the seat, and she hopped in, and I took her over to in the South Airport area, and took her into an area, and my son was there, and I killed her. I'm real sure my son didn't see it, but that only happened one time.
But that was a pretty good ruse. So why didn't you do it again?
Well, for one thing, I didn't want my son to see that happen again, because that's when I was really killing a lot of them. And another thing, it never came to an opportunity again to do it. I had him in my truck one time. He was sleeping, and I picked up another prostitute, but I didn't date her.
Ridgway also said that he preferred to pick up young sex workers because they were more vulnerable, and they didn't know the ropes. When they told him they'd only done this a few times, he believed it. He told them, quote, "I talked to them before I had sex with them, and she'd say, 'I've only done this a few times before.' I mean, if she's 13 or 14 years old, you figure that's true. If you got one that's 20 and 25, that talks the slang, and everything they say, 'I've only done this a few times,' they probably got an arrest record and they're lying. But the young ones stood out more because they talked when they were dying." He did talk about how a few times, but not many, during his killing spree, that he'd pick up a sex worker intending to kill her, but that didn't happen often. He also sometimes would go through with a date in the hopes that the women would feel more comfortable in his car the next time he picked them up, and then he would take her back to his house and kill her. He often had intercourse with the victims before so that he could get them as naked and vulnerable as possible before he strangled them, and he always strangled his victims. Ridgway initially said in an interview that he had stopped killing in 1985 when he met his second wife, but the date changed when he admitted that he had killed women till his arrest in 2001. But his later crimes were amateur, and much less frequent than his killings from 1982 to 1985. Ridgway had a hard time remembering specific victims. He remembers the killings, but not the faces of the victims. This is believed to be because of his psychopathy. They were not people to him. They meant nothing but property. He would remember where he placed the bodies, what time of day, and what the weather was like, but not who these women were.
It says here, I killed the 48 women listed in the state's second amended information. In most cases, when I murdered these women, I did not know their names. Most of the time, I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory for their faces. I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. Is that true?
Yes, it is.
The statement continues, I have reviewed information and discovery about each of the murders with my attorneys, and I am positive that I killed each one of the women charged in the second amended information. I killed them all in King County. I killed most of them in my house near Military Road, and I killed a lot of them in my truck, not far from where I picked them up. I killed some of them outside. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found. Is that true?
Yes.
Your statement continues, I have discussed with my attorneys the common scheme or plan aggravating circumstance charged in all these murders. I agree that each of the murders I committed was part of a common scheme or plan. The plan was, I wanted to kill as many women I thought were prostitutes as I possibly could. Is that true?
Yes.
Your statement continues, I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes, and I did not want to pay them for sex. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Is that true?
Yes.
Your statement continues. Another part of my plan was where I put the bodies of these women. Most of the time, I took the women's jewelry and their clothes to get rid of any evidence and make them harder to identify. I placed most of the bodies in groups which I call clusters. I did this because I wanted to keep track of all the women I killed. I liked to drive by the clusters around the county and think about the women I placed there. I usually used a landmark to remember a cluster and the women I placed there. Sometimes I killed and dumped a woman intending to start a new cluster and never returned because I thought I might get caught putting more women there. Is that true?
Yes.
He often talked about how it was his career to kill these women, but that they meant nothing to him. He spoke about how often he visited his victims after he dumped them and have intercourse with their bodies, saying it was a way of delaying picking up another live victim immediately. He often talked about the significant burden of having to dispose of his victims, having to find places for them. Ridgway said that if he killed them in his home, he would dispose of the body quickly, removing them within a half hour. He would often drag them with plastic or a rug to his door and back to his truck, put them in the back under the canopy, and he'd even turn the lights off to ensure that they didn't see him moving the body from his home. He had a set of rules he would follow when disposing of bodies. He tried never to leave a body where he killed them. He always drove to a secluded place to dump the body. He would pull his truck away and then walk back to drag the body deeper into an area. He almost always left them naked, so there was little physical evidence. In the case of the Green River victims, he said that he put the women at the bottom of the river because police already had found 2 of his victims and he didn't want them to have them. He considered these victims things, property, that belonged to him. Ridgway is believed to have taken this long to catch because he was extremely careful. Unlike other serial killers, he did not keep trophies, and he didn't keep anything in his house or his person from the victims. He would, however, sometimes put pieces of jewelry he'd taken off of the victims and leave them in the bathroom of Kenworth Trucking. He had hoped that his coworkers would take the jewelry, and sometimes he would see some of those coworkers wearing his victims' jewelry. He also took the polygraph in 1984 without an attorney. He is believed to have passed that polygraph because of his psychopathic nature. It's designed to measure stress, and with that, he felt none. Even though he could not remember the women, he could remember what happened to himself or his property or where he left them with extreme detail. Ridgway also didn't have a racial preference. He did say in the interview that he preferred white women, but in the end, it was the kill that mattered, not what they looked like.
20 years and dozens of victims later, Gary Ridgway admits in a King County courtroom he is the Green River Killer. And that's what investigators, prosecutors, and those with loved ones murdered by Ridgway have been waiting a long time to hear. In a courtroom packed with the families of those he murdered, Gary Ridgway took a deadly place in U.S. history.
And Mr. Ridgway, is it your desire to plead guilty to the 48 charges of aggravated murder in the first degree because you believe that you are guilty of each of those offenses?
Yes. And that's the same answer Gary Ridgway gave 48 times. Yes, for each of the women he killed in one of the deadliest murder sprees in U.S. history. In court, he would say little more than that, letting a prosecutor read his disturbing account of so many murders.
One man ended a 20-year mystery Wednesday over who killed 48 women in the so-called Green River killing spree of the 1980s. In a deal to avoid the death penalty, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to killing all 48 women, most of them found in the Seattle area. Many victims, relatives rather, of the victims, who included teenage runaways, were in the courtroom when he confessed.
When Gary Ridgway was asked about his first kill, he couldn't really remember. He said that he'd left bodies before Wendy Caulfield in more open places, like against a fence or in the street or a well-walked area. But he didn't see any reports of the killings, so he assumed the women had gained consciousness and walked off. He told the task force that he might have killed a sex worker in the 70s while married to his second wife, that he was on a date and something went wrong, and he might have killed her. Though they could never get the exact details of his first murder, Ridgway admitted to having an interest in killing at an early age. When he was about 16, he remembered seeing a boy playing. He remembered walking up to the boy, taking a knife out of his pocket, and stabbing the little boy in the side. He didn't know the boy, and he didn't know what happened after he ran off clutching his side. He just wanted to know what it felt like to stab someone, and did it. Talking about the boy, he said, quote, "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I was at the right place at the right time. I guess what you'd call it." The task force had actually been able to locate that boy, now a grown man living in California. He had been able to confirm that a boy about 10 years older than him had taken him to the woods and stabbed him. The boy, however, made it to the hospital where he had surgery, and he never returned to school, so the suspect was never found. Once he recovered, his family had moved to California, and that statute of limitations had long passed the assault. So who was Gary Ridgway? Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the middle of 3 boys. When he was 11, his family moved to King County, Washington, where they had a house close to the Pacific Highway South, where he ultimately found most of his victims. His father worked as a bus driver, and Ridgway's claimed that his father would bring him along complaining about all the sex workers on the streets that he saw, His mother worked at a department store part-time. Ridgway has said that he wet his bed into his early teens, and his mother would wash his genitals after every incident. He also stated that he had anger and sexual attraction towards his mother, and that he fantasized about killing her.
I didn't really think I had an urge to kill her. I just wanted her to stop. And
But what did you want to do to her?
what did I want to do with her? Just to have her stop and
But how would you do it? What did you think in your head about how you would do it? That's what we're trying to get at. When did you first think about treating your mom violently to get what you wanted her to do?
Probably in 4th grade.
Okay, there we go. Fourth,
fifth, and 6th was probably up to that grade.
and what was in your mind that you wanted to do to get her to treat you a certain way? What did you want to do to your mom here?
I wanted her to stop being angry at me for not knowing how to...
But she wasn't stopping.
No, she wasn't stopping.
Was she?
No.
She kept picking at you, belittling you, embarrassing you. I mean, that's pretty clear from yesterday.
It happened in school too, so I had...
So what was your way of retaliating against her in your mind? What were you thinking to do to your mom?
I don't know if I was thinking of hurting her. I just wanted her to stop and let me alone. Angry at her for pushing on me to remember, and I just couldn't remember, and I just wanted her to stop.
But she didn't.
But she didn't know.
She didn't stop. So somewhere in the 4th or 5th grade, that sense of helplessness that you had not being able to get her to stop would very likely have produced thoughts of taking back some power and control over your mom to get the bitch to shut up. I mean, I'm sorry, but Gary, that's what we hear. And that's what one of the things we're looking to get a better understanding of.
During that thing, I usually took it out on other things instead of hurting her.
Living things?
Living things, killing animals.
Okay.
Killing animals. I stabbed a kid one time.
Okay.
Stabbed a kid with a knife.
Tell me about that.
Down by Chinook, where I used to go to school. And boy was playing, I stabbed him in the side and didn't kill him. And I think it must have been about 6th grade, I think it was 7th grade. And that was at some time I was breaking out windows, throwing rocks at windows at school.
Not interested in that.
But that's what I took my aggression on. I couldn't take it on my mom. I had to take it on my animals and
How many
the
animals
kids.
did you kill?
I killed a lot of birds, but one cat suffocated in his chest, and shot babies at dogs to hurt them, and threw rocks at my brother about that time. I think I was getting out of that, though.
You couldn't take your aggressions out on your mom.
No, I couldn't.
But you could think about it.
I could think about it, and
What'd you think?
I thought about hurting her, so she'd shut up and leave me alone, and then
How did you think about hurting your mom?
killing her.
And how would you do that?
I thought with my hands, or I didn't have no guns or anything, so I didn't. It had to have been hands or.
And then after she was dead, what were you going to do in your head?
In my head, I don't know what I would do. I just wanted her to stop.
His mother died a few years before he was arrested, and his father died in the early 90s. Ridgway is believed to have an IQ in the low 80s. He was held back twice in school and graduated in 1969 from Tyee High School. After high school, he joined the Navy. While in the military, he married his high school sweetheart in 1970. He was deployed to the Philippines, which he admitted was his first time experiencing sex workers. In 1971, he was honorably discharged from the Navy and returned home. While he'd been away, his first wife had begun a relationship with another man and had filed for divorce, and they were divorced by 1972. Ridgway would say his wife had become a whore while he was overseas. In August 1971, he started a job at Kenworth Trucking, which he kept for over 30 years until his arrest in 2001. His job was only a few miles north of where he picked up most of his victims. In 1972, he met his second wife. They were married in December 1973, and they lived in several residences during their marriage. In 1975, they had a son named Michael. His second wife would remember that Ridgway liked to have sex outside and had been interested in bondage. He liked to practice walking silently when they walked in the woods, coming up behind her and scaring her. She would report that he often came home later than expected, wet and dirty. In the later years of their marriage, he would come home later and later. At least once, Ridgway admitted that he came up behind his second wife and choked her in what he called a police-style chokehold. After their relationship deteriorated in 1980, they separated. In 1981, their divorce was finalized, and she got full custody of their son. Ridgway then only got to see him on alternate weekends. In November 1981, Ridgway bought his house at 21859 32nd Place South, King County, Washington. This was where, in his 2003 interview, he admitted to taking and killing the majority of his victims. He admitted that he didn't kill any woman in the house for 6 months in 1982 when he had renters living in the house, and he lived alone there until 1985. After his second divorce, Ridgway had several relationships with women. Some he met at organizations for single parents, parents without partners. He even got engaged again and planned to be married in June 1984, but she ultimately ended the engagement after she had met someone else. In February 1985, he met his third wife at the Parents Without Partners group. Several months after they started dating, she moved into his house in Place South. In 1988, they got married. They moved several times, but always stayed in the King County. From 1989 to 1997, Ridgway owned a residence in Des Moines, Washington. He then moved to Auburn, Washington, where he lived until his arrest in 2001. His third wife and many of his ex-girlfriends would be shocked to learn that Gary Ridgway had been killing women during their time dating him. His third wife has talked about how he was an amazing, caring, and involved man, and that they had a good marriage. She said that he was good with his son and her children, and that she loved him at first sight. However, they got divorced in 2002 after his conviction.
Gary had always been a loving husband.
He made me feel like a newlywed every day.
They met in 1985, married in 88. She moved into Gary's modest Rambler in SeaTac, a home where, unbeknownst to her, scores of young women had been brutally murdered. From there, they moved to their dream home in Auburn. Judith describes their life as loving and content. They were surrounded by treasured pets and took many weekend trips that hold fond memories even today.
What I miss the most is the love that I had in our life. And he was the best. To me, anyway.
That's why it was easy for Gary to convince her. His arrest was just a case of mistaken identity.
He was reassuring me that everything would be okay, and it was painful.
Painful in part because the pieces just didn't fit. Gary had never raised a hand to her, never even raised his voice. And if he was away from home, he always had a logical explanation. He was working overtime at Kenworth or attending a union meeting.
You never saw anything suspicious?
No.
Still, detectives went through the Ridgways' cozy home with a fine-tooth comb. This never-before-seen video shows the aftermath of a necessary but intrusive search that sent Judith reeling. Investigators seized her jewelry and some of her clothing, convinced they could be trophies Gary took from his victims. Still, in Judith's mind, Gary was innocent.
I was still in just such denial.
And then a series of discoveries and photographs shattered Judith's trust. Suddenly, all the pieces that didn't fit began to fall into place.
Judith found a stash of condoms in the couple's garage. Detectives found more stuffed in the framework of Gary's pickup truck. And it gets worse. They tore Judith's car apart. The crime lab found traces of semen. Investigators told Judith Gary had probably used her car to pick up some of his victims.
Then I felt the anger that he had sex with someone else, that he hurt me, that he betrayed me. He said he did not do anything with those women. But then when I found the condoms and stuff, then I realized that he did.
But for Judith, there would be one more staggering surprise. Gary had killed 4 of his 48 victims during the years he was with her.
Oh, I'd say, why, you son of a bitch, why did you do this to me? Why did you put me through all this?
And why, Judith thought, did he kill all those women?
Do you think about the women and their families?
Oh, yes. My heart goes out to all of the families and the victims that he hurt, and I can't even imagine what they've been through.
And what about him, the man she believed was her Prince Charming? Judith refuses to visit Gary in prison. She won't take his calls, and she told him to stop writing letters. But her heart is still conflicted.
Do you love him?
No. I love the man I knew, and I hate the man that took him away.
Law enforcement believed that Ridgway got away with his crimes for so long because he didn't fit popular perceptions of a serial killer at the time. He wasn't a loner. He'd always been in a relationship or married. He had no violent criminal history. He was steadily employed for 30 years. After his arrest and confessions, his brother came forward saying that he had never displayed any abnormal behavior in front of him. The people who knew Gary Ridgway best didn't know him at all. Gary Ridgway is considered to be one of America's most prolific serial killers, having been convicted of 49 murders and is believed to have killed more than 70 women between 1982 and 2001. At that time, only one known victim had escaped Ridgway, Rebecca Guay, and her case could never go to trial as a statute of limitations had passed by 2003. These are Gary Ridgway's confirmed victims. Gary Ridgway had 3 unidentified victims. One victim was known previously as Bones 10, but was identified in 2020 as Wendy Stevens, who was Ridgway's youngest victim at 14 years old. She had run away from her home in Denver, Colorado in 1983, and her remains were found in March 1984. The last 2 unknown victims are called Jane Doe B-17, who was found in 1986, and Jane Doe B-20, who was found with the help of Ridgway in 2003. Authorities are still hopeful to identify both victims.
Ridgway confessed to 49 murders over the course of several years back in 2003 and has been rotting away in a cell ever since. But detectives have still been trying to place names with a couple of his unidentified victims, including a young woman whose remains were found in southeast King County in January of 1986. Forensic evidence suggests she was in her mid to late teens when Ridgway killed her, and she may have been from out of state. This now is how they believe the woman looked after they used, in easy-to-understand terms, DNA analysis from a company called Parabon Labs to isolate her genetic makeup in terms of hair color, eye color, and the like, and with the help of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that was able to put this composite sketch together.
Creating the structure of what we think this child's face could be, and that's using a 3D modeling software based on a CT scan of the skeletal remains. That 3D modeling software allows us to put digital clay on top of the skull in order to create a facial approximation as to what we think she could have looked like. The goal of that is to obviously get the face out to as many people in the public through whatever means we can.
Authorities believe that there may still be more victims out there. We may never know the exact number that Ridgway killed. Gary Ridgway currently resides in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He will never be free, and he will die in prison. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Again, I only do these serial killer deep dives a couple times a year. There are lots of work to put together. If you want me to do these more often, please let me know by liking the video and commenting down below. Who do you want me to cover next? As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Other ways to support the channel by joining my Patreon or channel membership. I also have merch, and you'll find all the links in the description box, plus a few extras. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for more. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. It is very much appreciated. That's it for me. I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.